I'm Arthur now, 87 if we're counting honestly, though I stopped correcting people a few years back when they guessed lower. Let them have that small victory. Age, I've learned, is less about the number and more about the quiet negotiations you make with your own body. Mine had been renegotiating terms for a while before anyone else noticed. I used to be a machinist, worked 38 years in the same factory, back when things were built to last, and men believed they were too. I believed in routine, in showing up, in fixing what broke. That was my whole philosophy. If something stopped working, you didn't replace it, you figured it out, adjusted it, made it run again. I suppose that's why when my daughter Carol started hinting that maybe I shouldn't be living alone anymore, I treated it like a faulty gear instead of a final failure, something that just needed tightening. After my wife Eleanor passed 8 years ago, the house got quieter, but I didn't. I kept to my schedule. Up at 6, coffee at the same chip mug, radio on low. I'd read the paper from front to back, even the sections I didn't care about, just to keep my mind moving. I told myself I was doing fine, and in some ways I was. Bills got paid, the lawn got cut, though slower each season. I still drove to the hardware store every Thursday, even if I didn't need anything. It was about continuity, about proving that nothing essential had changed. But there were signs, small at first, like a machine starting to hum differently. I dropped things more often. Tools would slip right out of my hand like they belonged to someone else. My knees started arguing with me on the stairs, especially the last few steps down to the basement. So I stopped going down there unless absolutely necessary. Told myself I was being practical. In truth, I was avoiding the feeling of not being in control. Cooking became an afterthought. I used to make full meals, real ones, the kind Eleanor taught me. Now it was toast, canned soup, whatever didn't require too much standing or thinking. The fridge held more condiments than food. One night I realized I'd eaten crackers for dinner 3 days in a row and hadn't even noticed. That bothered me, but not enough to change it. Change takes energy, and energy was becoming a currency I spent carefully. Carol noticed before I admitted anything. She came by one afternoon unannounced, same way her mother used to, and started opening cabinets like she was taking inventory. "Dad, when was the last time you went grocery shopping?" I shrugged. Gave her some vague answer. She didn't argue right away, just nodded in that way that meant she was storing the information for later. That's how it started. Not with a confrontation, but with quiet observations stacking up against me. Then came the conversations. First gentle, then more direct. "Maybe you could stay with me for a while. Just until we figure things out." I knew what that meant. Temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent when you're old. I'd seen it happen to friends. You move in for a bit, then your house gets sold, your things get divided into boxes, and suddenly your life is reduced to a single room and someone else's schedule. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. So I said no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just firmly. "I'm fine here." It became my refrain. The more they pushed, the more I dug in. Not because I didn't understand their concern, but because I did. Too well. Their fear wasn't really about me falling or forgetting something. It was about responsibility, about not wanting to be the one who missed the moment things went wrong. I couldn't blame them for that. But I also couldn't let their fear dictate the rest of my life. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't get to me. Late at night, when the house settled and every creak sounded louder than it should, I'd think about it. What if I did fall? What if no one found me for days? It's a different kind of fear, quieter but heavier, Not dramatic, just persistent, like a slow leak you can't quite locate. One afternoon, carrying a box of old tools from the garage, I misjudged the step into the house. Not by much, just enough. My foot caught, my balance shifted, and for a second I was suspended between standing and falling. I managed to grab the door frame, steady myself, but the box slipped. Tools scattered across the porch, metal clanging against wood. I stood there, heart pounding harder than it should have, staring at a screwdriver rolling toward the edge. It wasn't the near fall that shook me. It was how close it had been, how easily it could have gone the other way. I sat down right there on the porch, surrounded by the mess, and for the first time I didn't immediately start fixing it. I just sat, listened to my own breathing, to the distant sound of a car passing by, to the realization creeping in that maybe I wasn't as steady as I'd been pretending. That evening I considered calling Carol, telling her maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to look at other options. I even picked up the phone, dialed halfway, then stopped, because once you say yes to that, you don't really get to take it back. It sets things in motion. And I wasn't ready for that kind of finality. So instead, I made smaller adjustments, moved things I use daily to easier to reach places, started leaving lights on in the hallway at night so I wouldn't have to fumble in the dark. I kept my phone in my pocket, even inside the house, which felt ridiculous at first, but also strangely reassuring. These were my compromises, my way of staying in control without admitting defeat. It was around this time that I started noticing Daniel next door more. Young man, early 30s maybe, always in a hurry, always juggling something. He had a little boy, no older than 6, who liked to ride his bike up and down the sidewalk like he was training for something important. We'd exchange nods at first, then a few words. Nothing deep, just neighborly. One Saturday morning, I was out front trying to fix a loose hinge on my gate. The screwdriver kept slipping, my hand not cooperating the way it used to. Daniel walked over, watched for a moment, then said, "Mind if I give that a shot?" I almost said no out of habit. Pride is a stubborn thing. But something in me paused. "Go ahead," I said, handing it over. He fixed it in under a minute, tightened the screws, adjusted the alignment, tested it twice. "There you go." I thanked him, tried to keep it casual, like it wasn't a big deal, but it was. Not the hinge itself, but the act of letting someone else step in. After that, things shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel would stop by now and then, ask if I needed anything from the store. At first I declined every time. Old habits, but one day I said yes. Just a few items. Bread, milk, nothing complicated. When he came back, he didn't make a big deal out of it. Just handed me the bag, said, "Let me know if you ever need anything else." It wasn't charity. That's what made it easier to accept. It was just help. Simple, unspoken. His boy Lucas started waving at me whenever he saw me outside. Eventually, he started coming over, asking questions about the tools in my garage, about how things work. I found myself explaining, demonstrating, showing him little tricks I'd picked up over the years. For those moments, I wasn't an old man trying to hold things together. I was just a man who knew things, passing them on, and somewhere in that exchange, something settled in me. A realization I hadn't quite put into words yet, but could feel taking shape. Maybe staying independent didn't have to mean doing everything alone. Maybe it was about knowing when to hold on and when to let someone else carry a piece of the weight. I still lived in my house, still woke up to the same routine, the same quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of alone anymore. There were small interruptions now, a knock on the door, a child's voice asking questions, a neighbor offering help without making it feel like surrender. Carol called a few weeks later, her voice careful, like she was stepping onto thin ice. "How are you doing, Dad?" I told her the truth, or at least a version of it. "I'm managing." And for the first time, that word didn't feel like a defense. It felt like a description. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Some things you have to understand yourself before you can explain them to someone else. But I knew this much. The story everyone expects, the one where you eventually give in and let yourself be moved somewhere safer, more controlled, wasn't the only path. There were other ways. Messier, less certain, but still valid, and I wasn't finished figuring them out. The mistake didn't arrive all at once. It never does. If it had, I might have recognized it for what it was. Instead, it came disguised as confidence, as proof that I still had everything under control. That's the dangerous kind, the kind that feels earned. After a few months of small adjustments, of Daniel checking in, of Lucas spending afternoons in my garage asking questions about wrenches and gears, I started to believe I'd solved the problem. Not fixed it entirely, maybe, but managed it well enough that the bigger conversations no longer applied to me. I wasn't like the others, I told myself. I hadn't given up. I'd adapted. And adaptation, in my mind, had always been the same as survival. Carol noticed the difference in my voice before she saw it in my life. "You sound better," she said one evening over the phone. I told her about Daniel, about Lucas, about the groceries and the little repairs. I expected relief, maybe even approval. Instead, there was a pause. "That's good, Dad," she said carefully. "It really is, but that doesn't mean you don't still need to be careful." I brushed it off. Of course I needed to be careful. I wasn't reckless. I'd lived long enough to know my limits, or at least I thought I had. The truth is, when you start feeling a little stronger again, a little more capable, you begin to forget how fragile things actually are. Not completely, just enough to take small risks you wouldn't have taken before. You stretch a little further, reach a little higher, trust your balance a little more than you should. It feels like progress. It feels like reclaiming something that was slipping away. That's exactly how it felt the day I decided to go down into the basement. It had been months since I'd gone down there properly. I'd avoided it, told myself there was nothing I needed badly enough to justify the stairs. But that morning I woke up thinking about an old toolbox I'd left down there. Not just any toolbox. The one I'd used for years at the factory. The one I'd kept even after retirement because it felt like a part of me. Lucas had been asking about different types of tools, about how machines used to work before everything went digital. I wanted to show him, not just tell him, but put something real in his hands. So I stood at the top of the basement stairs, one hand on the railing, looking down like it was a longer distance than I remembered. The light at the bottom was dim, the bulb probably weaker than it should have been. I hesitated just for a second. Then I told myself, "You've done this 1,000 times." That's the thing about memory. It convinces you that past ability guarantees present safety. The first few steps were fine, slow, deliberate. I kept one hand on the railing, moved carefully, just like I'd promised myself I would. Halfway down, I felt that familiar tension in my knees, the slight wobble that had become more common lately. I paused, adjusted my footing, took a breath. "You're fine," I muttered. And for a moment I was. It was the last 3 steps that got me. Not a dramatic fall. No sudden crash or loud impact. Just a misjudgment. My foot didn't land where I expected it to. My weight shifted too quickly. The railing slipped from my grip, or maybe my hand just didn't hold on tight enough. One moment I was steady, the next I wasn't. I came down hard, not tumbling, just collapsing awkwardly onto my side against the bottom steps. The air left my lungs in a sharp, humiliating rush. I lay there stunned, not entirely sure what had just happened. For a few seconds I didn't move, not because I couldn't, but because I was trying to understand how quickly control had disappeared. When I finally tried to sit up, pain answered me, not unbearable, but enough to make it clear that something wasn't right. My hip, mostly. A deep, aching protest that made every movement feel heavier than it should have. I leaned back against the step, breathing slowly, waiting for the pain to settle into something manageable. This is exactly what they were talking about, I said out loud, though there was no one there to hear it. The phone was in my pocket. I could feel it. That had been one of my precautions, one of the things that made me feel prepared. I reached for it, then stopped. Not because I couldn't use it, but because of what using it would mean. Calling for help would confirm everything Carol had been worried about. It would turn this from a private mistake into evidence. So I didn't call, not right away. Instead, I sat there gathering myself, testing small movements. I shifted my legs slightly. Pain, but tolerable. I pushed against the step, tried to lift myself. It took more effort than I expected, more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I managed to get into a sitting position, then slowly, carefully, I pulled myself up using the railing. By the time I was standing, I was exhausted. The toolbox sat a few feet away, exactly where I'd remembered it. For a moment, I just looked at it. Then I laughed. A short, dry sound. Not today, I said, and turned back toward the stairs. Going up was worse. Every step demanded more from my hip than I wanted to give. I moved slowly, gripping the railing tighter than before, aware now of how thin that line was between managing and failing. When I finally reached the top, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lucky, and there's a difference. I made it to the kitchen and sat down harder than I intended. The house was quiet, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Not just the fall. The illusion I'd been holding on to had cracked, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat there for a long time, staring at the table, replaying the moment over and over. Not the fall itself, but the decision to go down there in the first place. The confidence that had carried me to the top of those stairs. The assumption that I still knew exactly what I was capable of. That was the mistake. Not asking for help. Not telling Daniel, "Hey, can you grab something from the basement for me?" Not admitting that some things were no longer worth the risk. I'd been so focused on proving that I could still do things that I stopped asking whether I should. Later that afternoon, Daniel knocked on the door. I must have looked worse than I thought, because the first thing he said was, "Are you okay?" I hesitated. There it was again, that choice. Tell the truth or protect the image I'd built. "I slipped a bit," I said finally. "Nothing serious." He didn't look convinced. "Where?" "Basement stairs." He exhaled, not quite a sigh, but close. "Did you hit your head?" "No." "Can you walk?" "Slowly." He nodded, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation this time. "Let me take a look." I almost told him no, almost insisted I was fine, but the truth was, sitting right there in my hip, in the way I'd lowered myself into the chair, in the way standing up again felt like more effort than it should. So I let him help. He didn't make it a big deal. Didn't lecture, didn't say "I told you so," even though he easily could have. He just stayed for a while, made sure I could move without too much pain, brought me a glass of water, and said, "Next time you call me first. Next time." That phrase settled heavily in the room, because we both knew there would be a next time. Maybe not the same situation, maybe not the same mistake, but something. That's how it works. Aging isn't a single event. It's a series of adjustments, some of which you get right and some you don't. After he left, I sat there again, but this time the silence felt different. Less like independence, more like responsibility. Not just to myself, but to the people who were quietly becoming part of my life. That evening, I called Carol. She answered on the second ring. "Dad?" "I'm okay," I said immediately before she could ask. "But I need to tell you something." There was a pause, the kind that holds more emotion than words. "What happened?" "I fell. Basement stairs. I'm all right, just sore. Daniel came by, helped me out." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her thinking, weighing her response. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. That wasn't the reaction I expected. No panic, no immediate push for drastic changes, just gratitude. "I should have called sooner," I admitted. "Yes," she said gently, "but you called." We talked for a while after that. Not about moving or facilities or plans, just about what had happened, about being more careful, about maybe finding ways to make things a little safer, practical things, manageable things. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected, not defeat, not even relief. Exactly. Clarity. I hadn't lost my independence that day. But I had been reminded that independence isn't the same as isolation, and pretending otherwise, that was the real risk I'd been taking. The next morning, I asked Daniel if he could help me bring that toolbox up from the basement. He smiled like he'd been waiting for that question, and this time I didn't see it as giving something up. I saw it as choosing to keep what actually mattered. The lesson didn't arrive with any grand realization, no sudden clarity, no moment where everything neatly made sense. It came quietly, the way most important things do at this age, settling into me over days, then weeks, until I realized I was thinking differently without quite knowing when it started. After the fall, I moved more slowly, not just physically, though that was certainly true. My hip reminded me every morning that I wasn't as steady as I used to be. But it was more than that. I started pausing before I did things I once acted on without thought. Not out of fear exactly, but out of awareness. There's a difference. Fear freezes you, awareness guides you. Daniel brought the toolbox up that same afternoon, set it down in my garage like it had always belonged there. Lucas came by later, eyes lighting up when he saw it. I showed him how to open it, how each compartment had a purpose, how tools weren't just objects, but extensions of your hands if you knew how to use them right. He listened like it mattered, like I mattered. And in that moment, I understood something I'd been missing. I didn't need to prove I could still do everything. I just needed to stay part of something. For so long, I'd been measuring my worth by what I could accomplish on my own. How many tasks I could complete without help. How many parts of my life I could hold together independently. That was the standard I'd lived by. But somewhere along the way, that standard stopped serving me and started isolating me instead. Because doing everything alone isn't strength. It's just alone. The days settled into a different kind of rhythm after that. Not the rigid routine I'd clung to before, but something more flexible, more human. Daniel would stop by some mornings, not always for a reason, sometimes just to talk for a few minutes before heading to work. Lucas came over in the afternoons when he wasn't at school, and we'd spend time in the garage or sit on the porch watching the world move past at its usual pace. I started saying yes more often. Yes when Daniel asked if I wanted him to pick up groceries. Yes, when Lucas wanted to show me something he'd learned. Yes, when Carol suggested she come by for dinner instead of just a quick visit. They were small yeses, nothing dramatic, but they changed the shape of my days, filled in the empty spaces I hadn't realized were getting too wide. Carol came over that weekend, not in a rush, not with an agenda. She brought food, real food, the kind I used to make, and we ate at the kitchen table like we hadn't in years. At one point, she looked around the house, then back at me. "It feels different here," she said. "It is," I replied. She didn't ask me to explain, and I didn't try to. Some things don't need to be put into words to be understood. Later, as she was getting ready to leave, she hesitated by the door. "I was really scared, you know," she said, "when you told me about the fall." "I know. I still am, a little." I nodded. "Me too." That seemed to surprise her. Not the words, but the honesty of them. I'd spent so much time trying to appear unshaken that admitting fear felt like breaking character. But it didn't weaken anything. If anything, it made the moment more real. "I'm not going anywhere," I added. "Not yet. But I'm not pretending anymore either." She smiled then, a small, relieved kind of smile. "That's all I wanted, Dad." After she left, I stood in the doorway for a while, watching her car disappear down the street. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty the way it used to. There's a difference between silence and loneliness. I'd learned that the hard way. That night, I sat in my chair, the one by the window, and thought about the version of myself from a year ago. The man who believed that accepting help was the beginning of the end. The man who thought independence meant holding the line at all costs, even if it meant standing there alone. He wasn't wrong exactly, just incomplete, because what I understand now is that independence isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about having a say in how your life is lived, and sometimes that means choosing who you let in. I still live in my house, still wake up early, still drink my coffee from the same chipped mug. Some things don't change, and I'm grateful for that. But other things have. I don't ignore the signs anymore. I don't pretend I'm as steady as I used to be. And I don't treat every offer of help like a threat to my dignity. Dignity, it turns out, isn't about refusing help. It's about accepting it without losing yourself. Lucas knocked on my door this morning before school. He had a drawing in his hand, something he clearly spent time on. "This is your garage," he said, pointing at a collection of shapes that only made sense because he explained them. "And that's you." I looked at the figure he'd drawn. Older, maybe a little crooked, but standing there all the same. "That's a good likeness," I told him. He grinned. "You can keep it." I taped it to the wall in the garage, right above the toolbox. Not because it was perfect, but because it meant something. Because it was a reminder that I was still here, still part of someone else's world. I don't know how much time I have left. At 87, you stop pretending that question doesn't exist. But I also don't spend my days waiting for the answer anymore. I spend them here, opening the door when someone knocks, sitting on the porch when the weather's good, teaching a boy how to hold a wrench, letting my daughter worry about me a little, but not letting that worry take over everything. Living in the simplest sense of the word. If you're younger, maybe this all sounds small. Ordinary, it is. But don't underestimate ordinary. At this stage of life, ordinary is a gift. It means things are still moving, still connected, still meaningful in quiet ways. And if you're closer to my age, maybe you understand what I'm trying to say. Maybe you've had your own version of that moment, the one where you realize you can't do it all anymore. When that happens, you have a choice, not between independence and dependence, the way people like to frame it, but between isolation and connection.